right? So what is it that you should be doing? Well, you should be writing down what you know. And so you'll notice immediately that I have to now define some terms. I have to tell you what I think knowledge is in order to make that task practical and useful to you. Knowledge seems quite vague sometimes. It's kind of a philosophical notion. And I should warn you, I am a trained philosopher, so I know what knowledge is in that sense. And I'm going to give you 3 definitions of knowledge, only one of which is philosophical. So there's a philosophical definition we're going to work with, a rhetorical one, so about communication, discourse, conversation, and then I'm going to give you a literary one that's about writing. All right, so you'll get a sense of what knowledge is in the mind, a sense of what knowledge is in the language or in speech, and a sense of what knowledge is on the page. Right? Does that make sense? So remember, the first one's going to be a little bit philosophical, but it's not the issue. It's important, but it's not the only thing that's important. So here we go. Philosophers since the time of Socrates, they would say that knowledge is justified true belief. Right? And what they're really saying is that it's not enough for you to believe something. Think about this for a second. You all have a bunch of beliefs sitting here today. You all believe a bunch of things. You imagine that a bunch of things are the case in the world, right? But I hope you've all had the experience of believing something and then finding out at some later point that it's not true, right? You found out you believed something for a while, and then you discovered that you were in error, right? You were wrong to think that this was the case. I hope you've all had this experience. If you haven't had this experience regularly, you are about to have it very regularly, right? You will, here at university, you'll have it often. You should have it often. It's part of learning, right? So meet that expectation. But there's the important difference there between something we believe falsely and something we believe truly is one we have experienced hopefully many times, right? And so philosophers will say, don't just focus on your beliefs when you're trying to decide whether or not you know something. Figure out whether this thing you believe is true. And then we might think we're done. We might think, well, yes, knowledge is just all the true beliefs that we have, right? Everything that we believe, and that is also true, could this be knowledge? There's lots of different ways of philosophers are trying to go at this and try to show you that that's not enough, right? The one I'm going to use today is a very classic example of a watch. This is actually nonsense. This is not a classic example of what I was going to talk about. It's a classic example of something else. And so let's just watch again. Let's watch. The one I'm going to use today is a very classic example of a watch. If you have like an ordinary analog watch with hands on it, right? And the hands show, let's say, 7 past 11, right? So they show 7 past 11. But the watch is broken. So it always shows 7 past 11. Now suppose at exactly 7 minutes past 11, somebody asks you, what time is it? You look at your watch and you say it's 7 minutes past 11. And they believe you, and they go on with their day, and they catch their train and make it to their meeting and so forth. Everything works out fine because when they asked you and you looked at your watch, it was exactly 7 minutes past 11, right? So they formed a belief. It was a true belief, right? Did they know that it was 7 minutes past 11? Did they know? This is what we sometimes call a rhetorical question. The answer is no. You kind of feel that, right? You're wondering, why is that not good enough? You don't know because the procedure by which you figured out what time it was an unreliable one, right? Because if you, again, tried to use the watch at 12:15 to find out what time it was, you would get the wrong answer, right? So you've got a broken watch. It's not a good, in science we would say, it's not a good method for figuring out what time it is, right? So you're going to get it wrong more often than you'll get it right. And this is why philosophers like to add this notion of justification. And see, that's the problem. that that's not why philosophers added the notion of justification. If you think that example through, you realize that if you ask me what time it is, and I look at my watch and it says 11:07, and I tell you it's 11:07, then there's just no doubt that you have a justification for believing that it is 11:07. You have a belief. It is true if it is in fact 11:07. And if you asked me and I looked at my watch, you are justified in believing that it's 11:07. So really it's an entirely different counterexample. It's a challenge to this definition that I've presented, that knowledge is just justified true belief, because that's an example of you actually having a justified true belief. Now, there's actually a moment in the film there, in the lecture that I'm holding, where I point out that the method by which you gathered the data to decide what time it was might have been flawed. And of course that is kind of true. Because if we wanted to be scientific about this, if I wanted to say it's a scientific question what time it is, right? Then I'm going to need more information than just what one person thinks the time is according to his watch. Why? Because it might be a mistake. That watch may be in error. So if I'm going to say scientifically it has been demonstrated that it's 11:07, then yes, I don't have a justification, because I've only collected one piece of data, and I should have maybe asked 10 different people what time it is. They should have all looked at their watches, and if they had all said 11:07, then there's a better chance that I'm right about this. So in that sense, we can talk about just looking at your watch not being a justification. But I'm wrong to say that this is the classic example of why justified belief is not enough. It is in fact a classic example of why sometimes even a justified true belief may not be enough. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So since earlier on I bragged about being a trained philosopher, I thought I better just cut in there and say that is actually not entirely true. This is why philosophers like to add this notion of justification, right? You should have a belief, it should be true, and you should have a good reason to believe it's true, right? Now you might think, well, I looked at my watch, right? That's a good reason to believe. But of course then the watch itself has to work. Just like, well, I applied statistical analysis to my data set, right? Well, yeah, but it has to be the appropriate and right kind of statistical analysis that I applied to my data set, right? Or I collected semi-structured interviews from 27 people. Okay, but they have to be the right people in order to answer the question, right? So you have to have a justification. One last thing. I usually use a completely different example to explain this. For shortness of time, I decided here maybe to use this watch example instead. The example I normally use talks about prejudice, right? So if I form a belief on the basis of prejudice, so I make a snap judgment, and it happens to be true in that case. The example I usually use is you can't trust a bearded man, and you meet a bearded man and you don't trust him. Well, that's sometimes a legitimate, it's never a legitimate argument, but it sometimes leads to a true belief. So that would be a case of this, right? And in this case, if you're going to take your philosophy lessons from a man with a beard, then I guess my point is don't trust him all the time. It's not always justified. But I feel better now. So let's watch the rest of this lecture together, shall we? True, you need to have a justification to believe that it is true. You should know why it's true. The good thing about that definition of knowledge is that it basically tells you, what should, is this something that should go in my assignment? Is this something I've learned? Right? It gives you nice 3 questions to ask. Do I believe it? Is it true? Do I have a justification? Don't forget about this believing it. You should use your studies to learn how to make up your mind about something, to come to believe something. But the problem with it is its kind of philosophical nature, right? It makes you think that knowledge is this sort of exalted state of belief. You have to get yourself into the state of mind called justified true belief.